Deadpool and Wolverine doesn't ease you in. It kicks the door down, lights the room on fire, and then asks if you're emotionally okay while it dances on the ashes of the old Zeitman universe. It opens with a Deadpool who's supposedly moved on, settled down, and grown up, and then immediately reminds you that this guy will never actually be done causing chaos, especially when the multiverse is on the line. Picture this. It's Wade Wilson's birthday, and the vibe is aggressively normal. There's cake, friends, the whole found family thing that the previous Deadpool movies slowly built up, and for a second you could almost believe he's going to live out the rest of his life selling pre-owned cars and making bad jokes in peace. But that's the point of this opening. It sets up a version of Wade who thinks he's aged out of the costume, just so it can yank him back into it in the most ridiculous, violent way possible. Then the Time Variance Authority shows up and basically tells him the universe is over. Mr. Trest. Paradox walks in like a bored middle manager from outside of time and explains that Wade's entire reality is decaying because its anchor being, Logan, is dead, and without that central figure, the whole thing is rotting from the inside out. It's such a blunt, almost rude idea. Your world existed because Wolverine was in it, and once he's gone, you're on borrowed time. For a movie about a motor-mouthed assassin in red spandex, that's a surprisingly heavy thing to drop in the first act. And Wade reacts exactly how you'd expect, badly, loudly, and with absolutely no regard for cosmic rules. He's offered a neat, bureaucratic future on the sacred timeline, but the second he realizes that Paradox plans to just fast-forward his universe into oblivion with a device literally called the Time Ripper, he snaps right back into Deadpool mode. The first stretch of the movie uses this clash, middle-aged burnout versus multiversal HR. To set the tone, yes, there will be meta jokes and blood and needle-head drops, but underneath that, this is a story about someone who cannot accept that his time and his world might actually be up. So when you think about Deadpool and Wolverine's opening, it isn't just the funny intro before the real plot starts. It's the moment the film quietly lays out its real question. What do you do when everything that made you who you are is gone? Your universe, your anchor, your place in the story, and the universe itself is telling you to move on? Wade's answer is simple. You break the rules, you jump into the multiverse, and you go looking for the one person who can make your world matter again, even if the version you find is the worst Wolverine in the multiverse. On paper, Wade Wilson has done the impossible. He's retired. He's traded swords and pistols for test drives and sales pitches, living out this aggressively ordinary existence where the biggest threat in his day is whether someone walks out of the dealership without signing the paperwork. It's the kind of life that would bore most superheroes to tears, and you can feel that boredom creeping into every part of his routine. The jokes are still there, his mouth never really stops, but there's a tiredness behind it now, like even he knows he's outgrown his own bit. What makes this stretch work is how blatantly the movie plays with the idea of a post-credits Deadpool, trying to pretend he's just some guy. He's got his circle around him, the familiar faces that remind you there's real emotional continuity from the last two movies, but the energy has shifted. Wade's not the hungry chaos agent anymore. He's the guy who's already been through the ringer, lost people, and tried to stitch his life back together with duct tape and denial. You can feel him clinging to this illusion that if he just stays small enough, just stays in his lane, the universe will finally stop messing with him. But that's the joke. Wade doesn't do small. The world around him can't stay small either. Even in this quieter setup, the movie keeps poking little holes in his fantasy retirement. He's restless. He still chases attention. He still needs to be the center of the frame, even if that frame is a boring parking lot with balloons tied to each car mirror. It's like watching a rock star try to convince everyone he's perfectly happy playing acoustic sets in a coffee shop, while his fingers keep slipping into old riffs. The persona is too big for the room, and the room is starting to crack. The clever thing is that the film doesn't treat this normal life as a joke we're supposed to completely laugh off. There's a part of Wade that genuinely wants this to work. He wants stability. He wants a version of adulthood that isn't just blood and punchline. You can see it in the way he leans into the birthday celebration, in the way he plays along with the idea that this is his future now. The costume is in the rearview mirror. The explosions are off-screen, and for a few minutes, the movie lets you imagine a version of Deadpool who really has retired into domestic absurdity. And that's exactly why the interruption hits so hard. When the outside world, the bigger, stranger, more important universe, finally breaks in, it doesn't feel like a random plot device. It feels like reality crashing through the walls of Wade's delusion. All the cosmic bureaucracy and multiverse talk that shows up isn't just there to kickstart the story, it's there to underline a brutal truth. This guy doesn't get to fade quietly into the background. He's too loud, too self-aware, too tightly woven into the mess of timelines and franchises to ever be left alone. This tension between the life Wade thinks he wants and the life he actually gets is the backbone of the whole movie. He's aging, he's insecure about his place in a world that's moved on without him, and yet the moment the universe offers him a way out, he can't help but sprint straight back into the fire. That's the version of Deadpool and Wolverine that really hooks you early on. Not just a parade of gags and cameos, but a story about a man who keeps trying to retire from himself and keeps failing spectacularly. If you're happy with this direction, next I'll move into the true inciting incident segment, Wade's collision with the cosmic system that decides who matters and who gets erased, and how that pushes him toward Wolverine. Here's the thing about the Time Variance Authority in this movie. They're not villains in the traditional sense. They don't monologue about world domination or nurse some personal vendetta. They're worse than that. They're bureaucrats, and there is nothing more terrifying in a deeply human way than sitting across a conference table from someone with the power to end your world who is bored while they do it. Mr. C. Paradox, played with deliciously smug precision by Matthew Macfadyen, is the face of this institution as Wade first encounters it. He's polished, slightly impatient, and radiates the energy of someone who has had this exact conversation 10,000 times before and finds every version of it mildly tedious. He doesn't hate Wade. He doesn't even particularly dislike him. He just needs Wade's universe to be erased so the sacred timeline can stay tidy, and he'd really prefer to do this efficiently and be done with it by lunch. That specificity of character, not evil, just bureaucratically indifferent to your existence, makes him one of the most unsettling figures in the whole story, even when the movie is playing him for laughs. The mechanics of the threat are simple but genuinely bleak. Every timeline, every universe, has an anchor being, a person whose presence holds the whole thing together. Logan was that person for Wade's world. His sacrifice in the future timeline didn't just end a story. It quietly started the clock on an entire universe's expiration date, and now that clock has run out. Paradox's solution is the Time Ripper, a device that doesn't blow things up in spectacular fashion. It just quietly excises a dying timeline, pulling it out of the multiverse like a surgeon removing necrotic tissue. Clean, efficient, final. What's quietly devastating about this setup is the implication. Logan never knew he was carrying the weight of a whole universe. He died thinking he was saving a handful of children, giving his last breath to end his own pain and protect the mutants who needed him. And in doing so, he didn't just leave behind his friends and the people who loved him. He left behind the structural integrity of an entire reality. Wade has to sit with that. The man he couldn't save was more important than either of them knew, and now the bill is coming due. Wade's response to all of this is, characteristically, to refuse the premise. He pushes back, deflects, cracks jokes, and tries to negotiate with a system that genuinely does not care about his feelings. But beneath all the noise and the wisecracks, you can see the raw nerve the whole situation is hitting. This isn't just about saving a universe in the abstract. For Wade, this is about making Logan's death mean something, about not letting the person he failed be erased twice, once from the world of the living, and now from the fabric of reality itself. So he does the only thing that makes sense to him. He finds a loophole. If an anchor being is what his world needs, he'll find one. He'll hop through the multiverse, track down a variant of Logan, and bring that Wolverine back to stabilize his reality. It's a plan held together with sheer stubbornness and absolutely no approval from the cosmic authorities, which is about as on-brand for Wade Wilson as anything could possibly be. The multiverse search sequence that follows is one of the film's most revealing stretches, and not because of the action or the visual splendor of jumping between realities, though both of those things are absolutely there. It's revealing because of what it does to Wade emotionally. He moves from one Logan variant to the next, and each one is wrong, too polished, too noble, too finished, in the sense of being someone who's already arrived at peace with himself and doesn't need to be dragged back into a fight. Wade doesn't need a Wolverine who has it all figured out. That's not going to work for what he actually needs, which isn't just a strong anchor. It's someone who understands what it means to be broken, discarded, and still somehow not done yet. And then he finds him, buried in a bar in a timeline that has clearly moved on without him, sitting in a particular kind of quietude that isn't peace, it's defeat. This Logan isn't the mythic sacrificial figure from the 2017 film. He's not world-weary in a poetic way. He's world-weary in the very specific, unflattering way of someone who gave up on themselves so completely that even the world stopped arguing with them about it. His claws work, his healing factor works, everything that makes him functionally dangerous is intact. But the will, that core, burning stubbornness that defines every version of Wolverine worth watching, is somewhere underneath all the rubble, buried under years of failure and self-abandonment. This is the worst Wolverine in the multiverse, by the TVA's own assessment. Not the weakest, not the least powerful, the worst, because potential and capability mean nothing when the person carrying them has decided they don't deserve to use them. Wade finds this out quickly when his sales pitch, genuinely one of the funniest sequences in the film, delivered with the breathless optimism of a man trying to close a deal on a lemon, crashes into Logan's absolute refusal to care about anything Wade is selling. The humor in this first encounter is sharp, but it's sitting on top of something that matters. Two people with mirror image problems. Wade thinks he's not good enough to matter in a universe that's moved on. Logan has decided he's too broken to be worth anything to anyone. Neither of them has a clean self-image. Neither of them has resolved their grief. And yet here they are, the universe essentially forcing them into the same room because, apparently, the only thing that can save a dying timeline is two deeply damaged men who don't believe in themselves being pushed together until they figure out how to believe in each other. That's the engine of Deadpool and Wolverine. Not the TVA, not the multiverse mechanics, not even the threat of the Time Ripper. It's this collision of two fractured identities, both of whom are carrying weight they refuse to put down, and both of whom are about to get a lot worse before they get any better. Getting thrown into the void isn't the grand dramatic moment in Deadpool and Wolverine. It happens fast, almost casually, because that's how the TVA operates. With the offhand efficiency of an institution that has done this so many times, it barely registers as significant anymore. One second you're arguing with a man in a pressed suit, and the next, you're in a place that looks like the end of everything. And the void looks exactly like that. It's desolate without being beautiful. There's a quality to the landscape that sits between a junkyard and a graveyard. Heaps of discarded things from discarded timelines piled against a sky that doesn't quite commit to any particular time of day. The production design here does something quietly brilliant. Instead of making the void feel like an empty hellscape, it fills it with wreckage you recognize. Pieces of broken realities, echoes of places that used to mean something to someone, all dumped here because the system decided they didn't fit anymore. It's visually funny, but the joke has an edge to it. This is where things go when the universe stops caring about them, and ruling over all of it is Cassandra Nova. Let's talk about what makes her work as a villain. Because on the surface, she could easily have been a throwaway obstacle, someone to fight at the end, check the third act antagonist box, and get out of the way. But the film does something smarter with her. Cassandra Nova, played by Emma Corrin with a kind of serene, unnerving stillness, isn't driven by a master plan with 17 steps and a countdown clock. She's driven by something far more primal. She was rejected before she even had a chance to exist, psychically strangled in the womb by the very brother whose power and compassion would later define the X-Men's entire philosophy. Cast into the void before she could take her first breath in the real world. Her anger isn't theatrical. It isn't performed for the audience. It's the quiet, total fury of someone who was told they didn't deserve to live and has spent an eternity deciding what to do with that information. Corrin plays her like someone who has long since moved past the screaming stage of grief and arrived at something colder and more dangerous, a kind of absolute certainty that the universe is corrupt, that mercy is a fiction, the powerful tell themselves, and that everything that exists deserves to be unmade just as casually as she was. She doesn't choose scenery. She barely raises her voice. And somehow that restraint makes every scene she's in feel genuinely threatening in a way that a lot of louder, flashier MCU villains never quite managed. She's also, crucially, a mirror. Not just for Logan, though she is that, but for the film's entire argument about what it means to be discarded and what you choose to do with that experience. Wade was effectively erased from the MCU twice before this movie. Logan sacrificed himself and then watched his legacy get picked apart and moved past. Cassandra was literally thrown away by the person who should have loved her unconditionally. All three of them are people the machine deemed disposable. The difference is in what they built from that, or what they let it build in them. But the void isn't just Cassandra's kingdom. It's also the setting for the movie's most emotionally honest scene, and it doesn't involve a villain or a fight. It involves two men sitting with the weight they've been dragging since before the movie started. Logan's secret comes out here, and when it does, it reframes everything we've understood about why this version of him is the way he is. This isn't a Logan who failed in some abstract sense, or who simply gave up on heroism for no reason. This is a Logan who lost control in the most catastrophic way possible, who hurt the very people he was supposed to protect, his X-Men. The details of what happened arrive quietly, almost reluctantly, but the devastation in Hugh Jackman's performance doesn't require volume. The way Logan delivers it, with a kind of hollow, matter-of-fact exhaustion, like he's confessed this to himself so many times, the horror has worn the sharp edges off the words, is one of the best pieces of acting in the entire film. You believe in this specific guilt, in this specific version of a man who has decided that the best thing he can do for the world is to stop being in it. Wade's reaction is fascinating. He doesn't minimize it. He doesn't immediately launch into a motivational speech. For a beat, just a beat, he sits with the weight of what Logan just told him, and the silence is almost jarring in a movie that has almost never gone quiet this long. Then he responds, not with sympathy exactly, but with something harder to give, honesty. He tells Logan about his own failure, his own moment where he wasn't enough, where everything fell apart because of something he did or didn't do. It's the movie at its most vulnerable, and it earns every second of sincerity it asks the audience to sit with because it hasn't been manufactured out of nowhere. It's been building since those early scenes of Wade quietly falling apart behind a smile and a punchline. This is the pivot on which the whole film turns. Two men in a ruined corner of a discarded universe, choosing, not because the situation demands it, not because some external hero instinct kicks in, but choosing consciously to get back up. Logan doesn't suddenly have all his grief resolved. Wade doesn't magically shed his insecurity, but something shifts between them. A decision gets made, and the film respects that decision enough to let it be quiet and imperfect rather than triumphant, which makes what comes next hit considerably harder. Because Cassandra Nova moves fast once she figures out what Wade and Logan represent. Not just individuals with power she might use, but a potential doorway back into the real world, back into the timeline she was denied. Her plan to use the Time Ripper as a weapon rather than a disposal tool is genuinely clever in the way it turns the TVA's own instrument of order into a mechanism of annihilation. If the device can prune a dying timeline, she reasons, it can also be aimed at a living one, at the MCU's sacred timeline, at everything that still exists and breathes and matters. It's the logical endpoint of someone who was erased, deciding that if she can't have the world doesn't get to keep itself either. The fight in the void. And it is a genuinely spectacular one, brutal in the way only an R-rated MCU movie can afford to be, is set against the backdrop of that ticking clock. It's Wade and Logan, finally in sync, finally moving like they actually trust each other, going up against someone whose power isn't flashy in the Marvel sense, but whose control of the environment, whose psychic precision, makes every exchange feel like something could genuinely go wrong at any moment. The choreography doesn't just show you what these characters can do. It shows you how they've changed, how Logan's fighting now has purpose in it, again, urgency, the rawness of someone who has found a reason to not hold back, and how Wade, for possibly the first time, is moving without the usual theatrical layer of self-performance. He's just fighting, just present, just there. There's a version of this movie that gets to the void and just coasts on spectacle from here to the credits. Deadpool and Wolverine is smarter than that. It uses the violence and the chaos of the void sequences to externalize what's already happened internally. The breaking down of walls, the confrontation with damage, the decision to stop being a prisoner of your own worst story about yourself. The action and the emotion aren't running parallel in these scenes. They're the same thing, dressed in different clothes. And what waits on the other side of all that isn't resolution, exactly. It's the question the movie has been building toward all along. What does it actually mean to save something? A universe? A person? A version of yourself that you'd written off as a lost cause? Wade and Logan are about to find out, and the answer is more complicated and more honest than either of them expected. Start with this. Ryan Reynolds has been playing Wade Wilson in various forms for 16 years. He's outlasted studio regimes, survived a version of the character so bad the internet still uses it as a shorthand for franchise malpractice, and rebuilt something from genuine passion and stubborn persistence. By the time Deadpool and Wolverine arrives, Reynolds isn't just playing a character. He's playing a character who knows he's a character, who knows his own history, who carries the specific anxiety of someone who fought very hard to get here and isn't entirely sure he deserves to stay. The meta layer and the emotional layer aren't separate things in his performance. They're fused. And that fusion is what makes Wade Wilson in this film feel distinctly different from every previous version. What Reynolds does brilliantly throughout this movie is modulate the volume. Deadpool has always been loud. That's the whole design. A character whose primary defense mechanism is to never, ever stop performing. But Reynolds finds moments where the performance cracks, just slightly, just enough to let you see what's underneath. A man who equates visibility with worth, who has spent so long being the loudest voice in the room that he genuinely doesn't know what he is in the quiet. There's a scene early on where Wade's pitch to be accepted into the Avengers is flatly rejected, and the way Reynolds plays the aftermath isn't angry or defiant. It's small, briefly, privately crushed. He bounces back in seconds because of course he does, but that flicker of smallness is the emotional key to everything that follows. This isn't a man who's confident. This is a man who is terrified and has gotten very, very good at hiding it. His relationship with failure is specific and deeply personal. Wade isn't haunted by some abstract sense of inadequacy. He's haunted by the feeling of being unnecessary, of being the guy who was left off the list, left out of the big moments, left behind by a universe that kept moving without checking whether he made the cut. The TVA literally embodies this fear. Here is an institution whose entire mandate is to decide what matters and what gets erased, and it has decided that Wade's universe, his people, his life, everything he built, doesn't make the cut. Watching Reynolds navigate that, particularly in the scenes where Wade's bravado starts visibly running on fumes, is one of the quietly underrated pleasures of the whole film. The jokes don't stop, but they start sounding a little more desperate, a little more like a man throwing everything at the wall because he doesn't know what happens if he stops moving. And then there's Hugh Jackman. Let's be clear about something. What Jackman does in this film is not a victory lap. It is not a nostalgic curtain call or a crowd-pleasing callback packaged as an arc. Logan is one of the most emotionally demanding roles he's ever played in 20-plus years with this character, precisely because this version of Wolverine isn't the stoic warrior or the gruff protector or even the broken legend finding his final dignity. This Logan is someone who has specifically, deliberately decided to be nothing, and making nothing feel like a full, rich, devastating character state takes an extraordinary amount of craft. The physicality alone is worth pausing on. Jackman has always used his body as a primary storytelling tool with Logan. The posture, the economy of movement, the way the claws come out like a reflex tied directly to emotion rather than choice. In this film, the physicality is different. There's a heaviness in how he carries himself, not just physical, but existential, like the weight of every bad thing he's ever done is distributed evenly across his shoulders and has been there long enough that he stopped noticing it. He doesn't swagger. He doesn't even fully occupy the spaces he's in. He moves through the bar where Wade finds him like a ghost who hasn't quite accepted that the building has been renovated since he died. The reveal of what happened to this Logan's X-Men is the fulcrum of Jackman's performance, and the decision to play it with such deliberate quietness is exactly right. A louder, more theatrical reading of that confession would have made it feel like a climactic moment, a big emotional release the audience is supposed to applaud. Instead, it lands like a stone dropping into deep water. No splash, just the slow, terrible sinking. Jackman doesn't ask for your sympathy in that scene. He barely asks for your attention. He just states what happened with the flat exhaustion of a man who has rehearsed this truth so many times in his own head that it no longer has the power to surprise him, even as it has the power to destroy everything else around him. The absence of self-pity is what makes it genuinely gutting. What's fascinating is how Jackman also manages to play Logan's reemergence without making it feel like a switch getting flipped. There's no single moment where the old Wolverine suddenly reasserts himself in a blaze of glory. It's gradual, tentative, almost reluctant, like watching someone try to use a muscle they haven't used in years and isn't sure still works. When he starts fighting with full commitment again, it doesn't feel like a comeback. It feels like a decision being made in real time, quietly, without announcement. That's a performance choice that could easily have been played for maximum heroic impact, and Jackman consistently chooses the understated option instead. It makes the moments where Logan truly lets go in the action sequences hit so much harder because the restraint that precedes them is doing all the heavy lifting. The dynamic between Reynolds and Jackman is the real engine of the whole film, and it works for reasons that go beyond the fact that two enormously charismatic actors are clearly having the time of their lives in the same movie. Their chemistry operates on contrasting frequency. Reynolds runs hot, always moving, always talking, always filling silence with something. Jackman runs cold, still, watchful, economical with every word. In lesser hands, these registers would clash in a way that creates chaos without texture. What actually happens is that the contrast creates a rhythm, a genuine back and forth where each man's energy shapes what the other does. Wade's noise forces Logan to react, to engage, to have opinions about things even when he's decided not to have opinions about anything. Logan's stillness forces Wade to eventually run out of deflections, to sit in silence longer than he's comfortable with, to confront the things he keeps talking around. There's a version of their relationship that the movie could have built around the straightforward buddy comedy formula, funny man and straight man, bickering duo that slowly becomes a team. That version would have been perfectly watchable and almost certainly funny. But Deadpool and Wolverine is genuinely interested in something more specific. Two men who have failed in different ways, who use their personalities as armor against those failures, and who have to find a way to be honest with each other precisely because they have no shared history, no obligation, no relationship worth protecting. They can be truthful with each other in ways they couldn't be with people who love them because there's nothing to lose yet. And in a film full of spectacle and noise, those quiet, honest exchanges between these two characters are what you remember longest. It's worth acknowledging what both performances are also doing on a meta level, because this film is nothing if not aware of itself, and the awareness serves the character work rather than undercutting it. Reynolds playing a Wade who was anxious about his place in a franchise he wasn't sure would ever fully accept him is inseparable from Reynolds, the actor having spent years in franchise purgatory advocating for a version of Deadpool he believed in when nobody else did. And Jackman playing a Logan who has already had his perfect ending in 2017's Logan, who is being asked to come back and do it again, and who spends much of this film processing what it means to pick up something you already laid down, is inseparable from Jackman, the actor navigating exactly that situation in real life. The film doesn't hide from this. It leans into it carefully enough that it never collapses into pure self-reference, but openly enough that the meta-awareness and the genuine emotion amplify each other rather than canceling each other out. That's a difficult balance to strike. Most meta-cinema either goes all the way into detached irony or undercuts itself by trying to be earnest and winking at the same time. Deadpool and Wolverine threads the needle by anchoring every meta moment in specific emotional stakes. When Wade talks about characters like them not surviving this kind of story, the line is funny, but it's also genuinely frightening in context, because you've spent enough time with these two men by now to care whether they make it. The joke and the fear coexist. Neither cancels the other out. And that's entirely a product of what Reynolds and Jackman have built through these performances. Specific, grounded, deeply inhabited characters who feel real enough to be funny and human enough to be heartbreaking. What both actors understand at a cellular level is that the character with the most healing factor isn't always the one who gets hurt the least. Logan regenerates from physical wounds in seconds. Wade comes back from literally everything. But the wounds that accumulate in the void, the ones made of guilt and failure and the specific grief of not being enough when it mattered most, those don't heal on any timeline the film shows us. They just get carried and watched. The most powerful thing about both performances is how naturally these men carry that weight. Not dramatically, not operatically, but the way real people carry damage, quietly, imperfectly, without ever quite putting it all the way down. Shawn Levy is not the obvious choice to direct a movie like this. His filmography before Deadpool and Wolverine sits largely in crowd-pleasing, emotionally warm territory. Night at the Museum, Free Guy, The Atom Project. He's a filmmaker whose instincts run toward accessibility, toward keeping audiences comfortable even inside genre chaos. And you might think that sensibility is exactly wrong for Deadpool, a franchise that has always defined itself by its willingness to be abrasive, uncomfortable, and relentlessly self-destructive. But here's the thing. Levy's particular skill set turns out to be precisely what this specific Deadpool story needed. Because Deadpool and Wolverine isn't really interested in being transgressive for its own sake. It isn't trying to make you cringe or shock you out of your comfort zone as its primary mode. It's a movie about emotional vulnerability disguised as an action comedy, and that's exactly the kind of film where Levy's instinct for warmth becomes an asset rather than a liability. He holds the emotional core steady while everything around it goes gloriously insane, and that steadiness is invisible when it's working well, which, for most of this film, it is. His direction has a quality that's easy to underestimate: clarity. In an era of superhero filmmaking where action sequences are frequently shot and cut so rapidly that spatial coherence becomes an afterthought, Levy keeps everything legible. You always know where people are relative to each other. You always know the geography of a space before the chaos erupts inside it. This isn't a small achievement when you're dealing with R-rated violence, multiverse location hopping, and action sequences that involve two characters with radically different fighting styles sharing the same frame. The fact that every major set piece in this film is genuinely easy to follow, not simplified, but clear, is a craft choice that pays dividends every single time it matters. Take the highway fight early in the film. Wade against a squad of TVA operatives, alone, outnumbered, working through a space that the camera has already quietly mapped for you in the seconds before anyone throws a punch. The choreography can go as wild as it wants because the visual foundation is already laid. You're never lost. You always feel the spatial stakes, where the exits are, where the danger is coming from, how trapped or free Wade is at any given moment. That's direction as architecture, and it's more disciplined and intelligent than it looks. The action choreography across this film is R-rated in ways that actually mean something beyond the obvious gore. The violence is visceral without being gratuitous in the torture porn sense. It serves the characters and the tone simultaneously. When Logan's claws come out, the damage they do is real and specific and permanent looking in ways that PG-13 Wolverine never quite managed. There's a sequence in the Void fight where Logan tears through a line of Deadpool variants. Yes, actual Deadpool variants, and we'll get there. And the efficiency of it, the almost mechanical precision of his violence, tells you more about where his head is in that moment than any line of dialogue could. He's not performing. He's not holding back. He's moving like someone who has stopped protecting the world from what he can do and started using it. Wade's fighting style is choreographed with a different intentionality. His combat is expressive, theatrical even, full of flourishes that serve no tactical purpose but say everything about his need to be seen, to make an impression, to be the main character, even when the universe isn't sure it wants him. Early in the film, his fights have this quality of performance. He's playing Deadpool at himself as much as at his opponents. Watch how that changes in the Void sequence. The flamboyance doesn't disappear, it's too deeply baked into who he is, but it gets a purpose. The showmanship stops being defensive and starts being intentional. He fights like someone who has decided to own the chaos rather than hide inside it. Now let's talk about the needle drops, because this is the technical area where Deadpool and Wolverine does something genuinely distinctive, even within a franchise that has always used music as a storytelling weapon. The Deadpool films have always understood that the right song at the right moment doesn't just underscore action, it recontextualizes it, adds a layer of meaning or irony or emotional depth that pure score can't generate in the same way. But the third film takes this further than either of its predecessors by using music not just as tonal punctuation but as thematic argument. The selection of songs isn't arbitrary, isn't just, wouldn't it be funny if this violent scene played over this song? Each major needle drop is making a statement about the scene's emotional content, often in ways that cut against the surface tone. The use of N.S.Y. Sync's Bye 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 is the most obvious example of the film weaponizing nostalgia, and it's brilliant precisely because it's so committed. The song choice isn't just a joke about the early 2000s. It's a song about ending something, about getting out, about a relationship that's been going on too long with someone who keeps taking advantage, and playing it over a sequence about Marvel's Fox-era properties being definitively left behind is not an accident. The comedy and the meta-commentary and the genuine melancholy of saying goodbye to a version of these characters all land simultaneously, stacked in the same 4 minutes of screen time. That's sophisticated use of pre-existing music, and it doesn't happen by luck. The same sophistication applies to the selection of shares. If I could turn back time for what might be the film's most emotionally charged sequence. It's funny, sure, Cher in a Deadpool movie carries a guaranteed laugh, but that song is also specifically about regret, about wanting to undo damage you caused to someone you cared about the particular helplessness of knowing that an apology isn't enough to fix what got broken. Playing it at the moment it plays, over the characters it plays over, is not a random jukebox pick. Someone made a deliberate creative decision that the comedy of the song and the emotional weight of the scene should live in the same space, amplifying each other. And it works in the way the best needle drops always work, by making you feel two contradictory things at the same time and not letting you separate them. The score, composed by Rob Simonson, operates primarily in the spaces between the needle drops, and it has the difficult job of holding the emotional through line together across all the tonal whiplash. It mostly succeeds by staying agile, never committing so hard to a single mood that it can't pivot, never building to the kind of operatic swells that would feel fraudulent in a film this self-aware. When the score does allow itself to be genuinely moving, particularly in the quieter scenes between Wade and Logan in the Void, it earns those moments because it's been so restrained everywhere else. The visual effects deserve specific recognition, particularly in how they handle the Void itself and the Deadpool variant sequence. The Void is an environment that could have easily looked like a budget constraint dressed up as an aesthetic choice. All that desolation, all that emptiness, all that gray-brown atmosphere. What it actually looks like is a world that has texture and history, precisely because it's made of wreckage. The VFX team fills it with recognizable debris from other realities in ways that reward close attention. There are details you catch and details you miss, and the sense that there's more in every frame than you can process in a single viewing gives the environment a lived-in quality that purely digital landscapes often lack. The Deadpool variant scene is a technical achievement that functions simultaneously as fan service, comedy, and emotional gut punch, and keeping all three of those things in balance while rendering multiple versions of the same character in the same frame, with distinct enough visual differentiation that you always know who is harder than it looks. The brief appearances of Deadpool variants from other timelines, including moments that draw from the history of this character across different media, are managed with an efficiency that never lets the spectacle override the story. Each variant communicates something quickly, hits its moment, and gets out of the way. That kind of editorial precision in a sequence that could easily have sprawled into incoherence is a sign of very controlled filmmaking judgment. What Levy ultimately proves with this film is that technical craft and emotional intelligence aren't separate concerns in movie making. They're expressions of the same set of priorities. Every direction choice, every action sequence, every song selection, every VFX decision in Deadpool and Wolverine is in service of the same fundamental goal, keeping you invested in two specific people and what happens to them, even when everything around them is exploding, even when the movie is actively winking at you, even when the meta-commentary is running at full volume. The craft doesn't show off. It works, and working invisibly in a film this deliberately chaotic might be the most impressive technical achievement of all. There's a word the film keeps circling without ever quite landing on directly, and that word is irrelevant. Not death, not defeat, not failure in the conventional superhero sense of losing a fight or letting a villain win. The specific, quieter terror that sits at the heart of Deadpool and Wolverine is the fear of becoming unnecessary, of being the version of something that history decided not to keep, the draft that got thrown away when the final copy was printed. That's a stranger kind of dread than most superhero movies traffic in, and it's worth sitting with. The genre tends to organize itself around stakes that are enormous and external. Cities in danger, universes ending, extinction-level threats that need to be punched into submission. And yes, Deadpool and Wolverine has all of that on the surface. The Time Ripper, Cassandra Nova, the collapsing timeline. But the internal architecture of the film is built on something far more personal and far more universally recognizable. The feeling that the world has moved on from you, that your moment has passed, that the story you thought you were in has already reached its conclusion without you. Wade Wilson's entire arc is structured around this anxiety. He's not afraid of dying. He literally can't, in any meaningful, permanent sense. What he's afraid of is dying unnoticed, being pruned quietly, efficiently, by a machine that processes thousands of timelines a week and has no particular opinion about his. The TVA is the perfect villain for this specific fear because it doesn't hate him. It doesn't need to be defeated, exactly, or redeemed. It just needs to be convinced, or circumvented, or proven wrong. The terror it represents isn't malice. It's indifference. And indifference is so much harder to fight than hatred, because you can't appeal to it, you can't negotiate with it, you can't make it care by being brave or noble or funny enough. This is also, unmistakably, a film about franchise anxiety, and it's brave enough to say so out loud. The meta-commentary in Deadpool and Wolverine isn't decoration, it's argument. When Wade talks about characters like him not fitting into the new universe, when he processes the transition from Fox to Marvel as something that happened to him personally, the film is doing something quite radical. It's using a blockbuster superhero movie to examine its own cultural machinery. The MCU, at this point in its history, is a system. It makes decisions about what matters and what gets archived. It has its own version of the TVA, development decisions, character licensing, the corporate calculus of what gets greenlit and what disappears. Wade Wilson, living inside that system, aware of it, both benefiting from and threatened by it, is the film's most honest and pointed creative choice. But the theme doesn't stay at the meta level. It grounds itself in the human, and that's what saves it from becoming clever without being meaningful. Because the question, what happens to the things that get left behind, isn't just a franchise question. It's the question every person who has ever felt their moment slip away has to face. The parrot who gave everything to a career that ended without recognition. The athlete who peaked before anyone was watching, the person who loved someone who moved on and wonders, quietly, whether that love counted at all since no one's keeping score. Deadpool and Wolverine takes its multiverse mechanics and its comic book theology, and it uses them as a framework to examine something genuinely human, the relationship between purpose and witness, between meaning and memory. Logan's thematic strand runs parallel to Wade's, but cuts at a different angle. Where Wade fears invisibility, Logan fears legacy. Specifically, the wrong kind. He doesn't want to be remembered. He doesn't want the story of who he was to extend beyond the moment he decided it was over. His self-imposed exile in the void isn't just guilt, it's a deliberate attempt to ensure that his damage stops propagating, that the ripples he made in the lives of the people who trusted him don't keep spreading outward. He wants to be his own eraser, to contain his own wreckage, and the movie takes that impulse seriously rather than just treating it as something to be talked him out of with a pep talk. Because here's the thing about Logan's position that the film quietly refuses to simplify, he's not entirely wrong. The desire to stop causing harm, to remove yourself from a world you hurt, comes from a real place. The mistake isn't the feeling, it's the conclusion he draws from it, that the solution to having caused damage is to become nothing, that the only responsible thing a broken person can do is to disappear. What Wade and the film offers as a counterargument isn't, "You're not broken," or "It wasn't your fault." It's something more complicated and more honest, that your damage doesn't disqualify you from being useful, that guilt and purpose can occupy the same body, that the question isn't whether you've ever hurt anyone but whether you choose to be done with the world or not. That distinction between guilt and uselessness, between accountability and self-erasure, is one of the most nuanced things the film is doing, and it's doing it inside a movie with a scene where multiple Deadpool variants fight each other in a junkyard. The tonal range required to pull that off without either element undermining the other is extraordinary, and it only works because the themes are embedded in specific characters with specific histories rather than spoken aloud as abstract lessons. The concept of chosen family gets another workout here, as it has in every Deadpool film, but this installment earns it in a way that feels harder won than before. The first two movies established Wade's found family as a source of warmth and continuity, people who love him despite, and maybe because of, all his chaos. Here, that family is the thing at risk. The reason the fight matters, the answer to the question of why saving this particular dying universe is worth the effort. But the film is careful not to make the found family feel like a reward to be protected. They're the evidence that his life has already been worth something. That even if the TVA decided his timeline was expendable, the connections made within it were real and irreplaceable in the way that only specific, unrepeatable things can be. There's a strand of the film that deals specifically with female characters. Vanessa, Blind Al, and especially the way Cassandra Nova's origin intersects thematically with the film's preoccupation, and it's worth pulling that thread a little. Cassandra Nova is the dark mirror of everything the movie argues for. She was erased before she could become anything, denied even the opportunity to fail or succeed on her own terms, and her response has been to build a philosophy around that erasure. If I couldn't exist, then existence itself is the problem. The film doesn't entirely condemn this. It understands where it comes from, but it distinguishes between Cassandra's response and Logan's not by judging either of them morally, but by showing what each choice costs, what Cassandra's absolutism closes off, and what Logan's tentative, reluctant re-engagement opens up. The choice to keep going isn't presented as obviously right. It's presented as harder and more fragile and more worth making because of those qualities. The multiverse, as a thematic device, does something elegant in this context. In most Marvel storytelling, the multiverse is primarily a plot mechanism, a way to introduce variants, to explore what-ifs, to bring back beloved characters or reimagine familiar ones. Here, it's also a philosophical framework. The existence of infinite timelines means that every version of a story is equally real and equally disposable, which is actually terrifying if you sit with it long enough. It means that heroism doesn't accumulate into something permanent. It means that sacrifice doesn't register on any cosmic ledger. Every Logan across every timeline has his own story, his own wounds, his own moments of failure and grace, and the machine that manages all those timelines has no preference for any of them. In a universe like that, the only meaning available is local, personal, relational. The only version of significance that survives is the one that happens between people who actually know each other. And that's precisely what the film keeps returning to, not the grand cosmic stakes, but the irreducibly specific relationship between these two men. The ending earns its emotional register because it doesn't resolve these themes so much as hold them open. Wade's universe gets its anchor. Logan makes a choice. The timeline stabilizes. But the questions the film raised about purpose and legacy and the right to matter don't get answered with a neat bow. They get answered with a gesture, with two damaged men walking away from a battle they didn't expect to survive, toward a future neither of them fully imagined for themselves, and choosing to call that enough. Not triumph, not redemption in the operatic sense, just enough. Just the quiet, stubborn insistence that the choice to keep going has value even when no institution, no machine, no sacred timeline officially endorses it. That's the thing Deadpool and Wolverine is saying, underneath all its jokes and blood and pop songs and cameos and meta-commentary, that significance doesn't require permission. That you don't need the franchise to validate you, the timeline to acknowledge you, the universe to classify you as essential. You need the people next to you and the choice you make when everything is on the line. It's a deceptively simple argument to locate inside a movie, this noisy and this sprawling and this relentlessly self-aware. But it's there. It's real. And it's the reason this film stays with you long after the credits roll and the needle drops fade out. Numbers first, because they tell a story of their own. Deadpool and Wolverine crossed $1 billion at the global box office, ultimately landing around $1.34 billion worldwide and claiming the title of the highest-grossing R-rated film in cinema history. It didn't just outperform expectations, it obliterated them, opening to over $438 million globally in its first weekend alone. For context, this is a film that exists outside the main MCU continuity, stars a character who has spent most of his screen life in a rival studio's sandbox, and carries an R rating in a genre that has almost exclusively operated in PG-13 territory for its biggest commercial swings. By every conventional piece of industry logic, this movie should have been a moderate success with a passionate niche audience. Instead, it became a genuine cultural event. What that box office story actually says isn't just that people love Deadpool, or that they love Wolverine, or that they'll show up for Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman regardless of circumstances. It says that there is a massive, underserved appetite for superhero movies that operate at a different emotional register, rawer, less sanitized, willing to sit with genuine ugliness alongside genuine warmth. The R rating here isn't just about the violence, though the violence is visceral and specific in ways that PG-13 filmmaking genuinely can't replicate. It's about the emotional honesty that tends to travel alongside that creative freedom. R-rated stories are allowed to be messier, more contradictory, less obligated to arrive at tidy resolutions, and audiences responded to that permission, to the sense that the film wasn't managing their experience quite so carefully, wasn't smoothing off every rough edge before it reached them. For the MCU specifically, the implications are significant and still unfolding. Marvel Studios built its empire on a PG-13 foundation, and the conventional wisdom has always been that the widest possible audience requires the most accessible possible content. Deadpool and Wolverine doesn't just challenge that assumption, it demolishes it at the box office in a way that leaves no room for alternative interpretation. The highest-grossing R-rated film of all time is now a Marvel Studios production. That is a genuinely remarkable sentence to be able to write, and it will absolutely inform how the studio thinks about creative parameters going forward. The cultural conversation around the film was notable for what it centered on alongside the spectacle. In an era of franchise fatigue, where Marvel in particular has faced real audience exhaustion following a glut of Disney Plus series and diminishing theatrical returns on several Phase 4 and 5 projects, Deadpool and Wolverine arrived as a corrective, not by being bigger or more connected or more stuffed with setup for future stories, but by being smaller in its emotional ambitions and more specific about who it was for. It wasn't trying to service 7 active storylines or introduce the next 4 years of content. It was trying to tell one story about 2 people. The relief that generated in audiences, the sense that a blockbuster had decided to just be a movie for a couple of hours, was palpable in the response. Critics and audiences alike had kept reaching for the same word, fun, which sounds like faint praise until you realize how long it had been since a Marvel film made people feel that specific thing without qualification. Hugh Jackman's return deserves its own reckoning in the legacy conversation. Logan was widely and rightly celebrated as one of the finest superhero films ever made, a mature, grief-drenched, visually stunning farewell that gave the character the ending he deserved. When Jackman announced he was coming back, the reactions ranged from cautious excitement to genuine concern that the return would retroactively damage something that had felt complete and perfect. Those concerns were legitimate. The kind of closure Logan achieved is rare in franchise filmmaking, and reopening it is a genuine creative risk. What the film does with that risk is thoughtful in ways that not everyone immediately recognized. It doesn't bring back the Logan from that film, doesn't attempt to continue or revise his story. It finds a different version of him. A variant whose story never reached that kind of grace, who never got his Logan ending, who is still somewhere in the middle of the worst version of his arc. In doing so, it sidesteps the problem of diminishing what came before, while still delivering Hugh Jackman as Wolverine in a new context. The 2017 film remains complete and untouched. This film takes place alongside it, in a parallel space, and the coexistence of both is part of what the multiverse framework is for. It's not a creative escape hatch. It's an honest acknowledgement that one perfect ending doesn't exhaust a character's possibilities across infinite timelines. It just means one version got to rest. Ryan Reynolds' journey with Deadpool is one of the stranger and more genuinely inspiring stories in modern franchise history. The 2009 version of the character in X-Men Origins, Wolverine is a genuine piece of cinematic wrongness, so comprehensively mishandled that it functions almost as a case study in how not to translate a comic book character to screen. The decade-plus campaign Reynolds mounted to get a proper Deadpool film made, the creative control he fought for, the R rating he refused to compromise on, the Deadpool 2 leaked test footage that essentially forced the studio's hand. All of it represents a kind of creative stubbornness that almost never works at this scale and this expense, and that paid off in ways even optimistic projections couldn't have fully anticipated. Deadpool and Wolverine is the endpoint of that journey. The moment where the character he believed in is not just a franchise success, but an MCU institution. There's something quietly poetic about a story centered on a man who fears being deemed unnecessary, delivering the cultural validation it did. The movie worried out loud, through its own protagonist, about whether it had a right to exist. The audience answered with the largest R-rated opening weekend in history. If Wade Wilson had a box office-based argument for his significance, that's it. The cameos and fan service elements of the film, and there are many, some delightful and some bewildering, and most operating at the intersection of both, generated their own extended cultural conversation. The Void functions as a kind of museum for Fox-era Marvel properties, and the film's willingness to acknowledge those properties with genuine affection rather than dismissiveness was received warmly by audiences who had spent years watching the MCU apparently pretend those stories hadn't happened. It doesn't retcon or erase. It processes. It gives those characters a place to exist even as the larger franchise architecture moves forward, and that generosity of spirit, that refusal to treat what came before as simply embarrassing or irrelevant, is part of why the film connected so deeply with the fan base that had grown up with those earlier versions. What does Deadpool and Wolverine leave behind for the characters going forward? That question is genuinely open, in ways the film seems to intend. Wade Wilson is now definitively part of the MCU, carrying his full history, his full chaos, into a universe that will have to figure out what to do with him. The creative challenge that represents is substantial. A character defined by meta-commentary about franchise filmmaking is going to have to find new ways to be meta now that the transition he was commenting on is complete. The joke of Deadpool arriving in the MCU only works once. What comes after it is a more interesting creative question, and one that remains unanswered. Logan's ending here is deliberately ambiguous in its emotional register, and the film respects that ambiguity enough not to resolve it. He makes a choice. He shows up when it matters. He walks away. Whether that constitutes redemption in the way the film has defined redemption, not absolution, not forgiveness, just the decision to keep going, is left for each viewer to decide. That's not a dodge. It's the film being honest about the limits of what any single story can accomplish for a character carrying that much accumulated history. The thing about Deadpool and Wolverine that will likely matter most, looking back at it from a distance, isn't the box office record or the cameos or the fact that it's the first R-rated MCU film. It's that it made people care. In a cultural moment where franchise fatigue was genuine and documented, where superhero movies had started to feel like content delivery rather than cinema, where the question, does this need to exist, hung over every new announcement. This film provided an answer that wasn't defensive or explanatory. It just existed loudly and messily and specifically, and it trusted that being specific about two particular people's particular damage was enough to justify 2 hours of your time. That trust in the audience, in your capacity to find meaning in the chaos, to feel something real between the jokes, to follow two broken men into a junkyard at the end of the universe and care desperately about whether they make it out, is what separates the films that endure from the ones that are forgotten the week after they leave theaters. Deadpool and Wolverine is banking on the former. Given what it made, what it said, and how long it stayed in the conversation, the early returns suggest it made the right bet. Here's the question it leaves you with, the one that echoes past the credits and the needle drops in the post-credit scenes. What do you do when the machine decides you're expendable? What do you do when the timeline says your moment is over? When the franchise moves on, when the institutions that organize meaning decide you don't fit the current model, you suit up, you find the worst possible version of your best possible partner, and you prove, not to the machine, not to the timeline, but to yourself. That showing up is the whole argument. Wade Wilson would say, that's the most heroic thing anyone can do. For once, he might actually be right. There's a moment in Deadpool and Wolverine that stops the film completely, not for a joke, not for a fight, but for a quiet conversation between Wade Wilson and a woman named Laura. She isn't a major character in the traditional sense. She doesn't drive the plot forward. She doesn't deliver exposition or set up the third act. She sits across from Wade in the void and talks to him about Logan in a way that is so direct, so emotionally honest, and so specifically calibrated to land on audiences who watched the 2017 film and loved it, that it operates on a completely different frequency from everything surrounding it. And that is exactly what the cameo architecture in this film does at its best. It doesn't just deliver recognition, The dopamine hit of seeing a familiar face in an unexpected context. It delivers weight. It takes the accumulated emotional history of characters audiences have spent years with and uses that history as additional storytelling infrastructure. When it works, a cameo in this film isn't an interruption. It's a depth charge. Let's talk about the void as a concept before we talk about who's in it, because the creative decision to populate this wasteland with Fox-era Marvel characters is more carefully thought out than it might initially appear. The void, as established by the TVA mythology, is where things go when the machine decides they no longer fit the timeline. When you understand that, the choice to use it as a graveyard for Fox's mutant universe stops being a convenient fan service device and starts being a genuine thematic statement. These characters didn't fail. They were pruned. The system decided they didn't belong in the current model, and they ended up here. Not destroyed, not dishonored, just set aside, existing in a space between the stories they were part of and the stories that replaced them. That's a genuinely melancholy idea, and the film doesn't entirely play it for laughs, even when it has every opportunity to do so. Gambit's appearance is the one that generated the loudest reaction in theaters, and for obvious reasons, this is a character who has existed in development limbo for the better part of 2 decades, a version of a beloved X-Man who almost made it to screens multiple times and never quite got there. Played by Channing Tatum in a role he had been attached to long enough that it became a running joke about Hollywood's capacity to keep a project alive in perpetual pre-production without ever actually making it. When Gambit finally arrives in the void, playing cards in hand, accent intact, moving with the easy confidence of someone who absolutely should have had a movie years ago, the audience response isn't just recognition, it's relief. It's the resolution of a joke that went on so long it stopped being funny and started being genuinely frustrating. And the film acknowledges that while also giving Tatum something real to do in the time it has with him. What's smart about how Gambit is handled is that the film doesn't over-explain him or try to establish his history within the scene. It trusts that audiences who care about this character already know who he is, and it trusts audiences who don't to pick up enough from his personality and visual design to get the joke and move on. He exists in the scene as himself, fully formed, already arrived with no origin crawl and no backstory dump. That confidence, that refusal to hedge by over-contextualizing, is the right call. A cameo that stops to explain itself loses half its power in the explanation. Jennifer Garner's return as Elektra is a different kind of emotional payload. The 2003 Daredevil film and its 2005 spin-off represent a specific era of superhero filmmaking, pre-MCU, pre-Dark Knight, when studios were still figuring out what these movies could be and frequently arriving at answers that were, to put it generously, suboptimal. Elektra exists in cultural memory as one of the emblematic examples of that era's failures, and Garner herself has spoken openly about the experience in ways that suggest it wasn't exactly a creative highlight. Her appearance in the void, then, carries a strange and rather beautiful resonance. The void is where things go that the machine deemed expendable. Elektra, in a very real sense, was deemed expendable by the studio system of her era. And here she is in the junkyard of the multiverse, still standing, still formidable, still Elektra, the system's judgment about her commercial viability having exactly zero bearing on the validity of what she was. The film uses her well, partly because it doesn't use her too much. There's a particular discipline in how these cameos are deployed. They're granted the time they need and not a frame more. A lesser film would have lingered, would have found ways to squeeze every drop of recognition out of each familiar face. Deadpool and Wolverine consistently moves on, which is one of the primary reasons the cameo sequences feel energizing rather than exhausting. The pacing respects your time, which in turn makes you more willing to give the film yours. Wesley Snipes, as Blade, is perhaps the most formally interesting cameo in terms of what it's doing on a meta level. Blade, the 1998 film, is the argument many film historians would make for the true starting point of the modern superhero genre. Before Spider-Man, before X-Men, before the MCU's origin in Iron Man, there was Blade, an R-rated, stylistically distinctive, financially successful superhero film that proved the genre could work for adult audiences in ways the industry hadn't quite believed yet. Snipes' appearance in The Void is, in this light, the film acknowledging its own lineage, nodding to the vampire hunter who, in a very real sense, made all of this possible, including the R rating this film is built on. Blade didn't get to live in the franchise world he helped create. He got left in the void, commercially, when the genre he pioneered moved into safer, broader territory. Having him literally in the void, literally in the junkyard of things the machine moved past, is the film being historically conscious in the middle of its loudest comedic sequences. Whether or not casual audiences catch it, it's there, and it matters. The brief appearances of other Fox-era characters, including faces from the older X-Men films whose appearances are calibrated precisely to hit specific generational nerve endings without overstaying their welcome. All operate on this same principle, that the void is not a trash heap but a waiting room, and that the characters in it have inherent dignity regardless of the box office or critical fortunes of the films that contain them. This is not a film that looks back at the Fox X-Men universe with contempt or embarrassment. It looks back with the complex affection of someone who grew up on something imperfect and learned to love it anyway, who can see the flaws clearly and not let the flaws be the whole story. Now let's pull back from the cameos and go somewhere the essay hasn't spent enough time yet, the found family, and what it's actually doing in the emotional architecture of this film. Deadpool's found family, Vanessa, Blind Al, Dopinder, Weasel, and the rotating cast of damaged, devoted people who have orbited Wade's chaos across 3 films, is the emotional ground zero of the story in a way that's easy to miss because the movie doesn't make a big deal of it. It doesn't do the extended tearful goodbye scene, doesn't deliver the "this is what I'm fighting for" speech that franchise filmmaking tends to reach for when it wants to establish stakes. Instead, it trusts that you already care about these people from the previous films, and it uses that trust as collateral rather than cash. The value is there, it's just not displayed. Vanessa's presence in this story is interesting precisely because she's largely absent from the main action. She exists primarily in Wade's memory and motivation, which is a reversal of her function in the first 2 films, where she was a more active, emotional anchor. Here, she's the thing he's trying to get back to, the life he's trying to preserve, and the choice to give her less screen time rather than more is actually the right one for what this particular story is doing. It keeps her in the register of the life worth saving, rather than character who needs her own arc to justify inclusion, and in a film that is deliberately streamlined in its emotional focus on 2 men, that restraint is narratively intelligent. Blind Al's scenes are brief, but carry the specific warmth that Karen Sony and Leslie Uggams have always brought to their respective roles. There's a quality to the relationship between Wade and the people in his life that these films have always gotten right. The sense that these aren't people who love him despite his chaos, so much as people who have chosen to be his family, fully aware of what that means, who have signed up for the specific, exhausting, frequently dangerous experience of loving Wade Wilson and have never seriously reconsidered. That unconditional quality, which other films might play as purely comedic, has a genuine emotional resonance in Deadpool and Wolverine because the story is asking, what is a universe worth? And the answer it keeps arriving at is, whatever is irreplaceable in it. What makes a universe worth saving isn't its cosmic significance or its position in the sacred timeline. It's the particular constellation of relationships that exists within it and nowhere else. The exact version of Vanessa who loves the exact version of Wade, the exact version of Blind Al who has been putting up with the exact version of this man's nonsense for years. These relationships are non-transferable. You can find Logan variants in other timelines. You cannot find these specific people in this specific configuration anywhere but here. That's the film's quiet, emotionally devastating argument for why this dying timeline deserves to survive, and it doesn't make the argument loudly. It just places these people in your attention early and trusts you to do the math when the stakes clarify later. The meta-comedy mechanics deserve their own extended examination because they are genuinely complex, and the film runs them with a precision that's easy to take for granted. Deadpool's self-awareness has always been his primary comic device and his primary defense mechanism simultaneously. He knows he's in a movie. He talks to the camera. He names the tropes as they happen. In the first 2 films, this worked as a kind of anarchic energy, a character gleefully dismantling the 4th wall while the story quietly rebuilt it behind him. The joke was the gap between his awareness and everyone else's. In this film, the meta-commentary has grown up, or at least gotten more complicated. Wade doesn't just know he's in a movie, he knows specifically which movie, which franchise transition, which cultural moment. And the film is smart enough to recognize that there's a version of this where the self-awareness becomes a liability, where a character who comments on everything becomes a character you can't take seriously about anything. The solution it finds is elegant. It gives Wade moments where the meta-commentary goes quiet. Not many, but enough. When he and Logan are sitting in the void having their honest conversation, Wade isn't winking at the camera. He's just there, present. The 4th wall comes back up when he needs it as a shield, and it goes down when the scene requires real vulnerability. That modulation is what keeps the meta-comedy from curdling into pure, ironic detachment. There are sequences in the film where the meta-commentary and the emotional sincerity operate simultaneously, which is technically very difficult to execute. The scene where Wade is processing the possibility that Logan might not survive, using the language of movie tropes and character archetypes to express something that is clearly genuine: grief. This is the film at its most sophisticated comedically. The joke isn't that Wade doesn't care. The joke is that he can only express how much he cares through the vocabulary of the thing he's living inside. And underneath the joke, the grief is completely real. If you strip away all the references and the knowing winks, what you have is a man who is afraid of losing someone he's just started to care about. The comedy is the wrapping, not the content. Ryan Reynolds' delivery in these scenes is doing something technically demanding. He has to be simultaneously funny enough that the joke lands and sincere enough that the emotion underneath it registers. Too far in either direction and the scene collapses. Too funny and you don't believe the feeling. Too sincere and you lose the comedic texture that makes Deadpool, Deadpool. Reynolds holds the balance with what looks like effortlessness, and almost certainly isn't. This is the product of 16 years with this character, of understanding his rhythm so completely that the modulation between registers feels instinctive rather than calculated. The meta-commentary also does something the essay hasn't fully addressed yet. It functions as a critical frame for the superhero genre itself. Deadpool and Wolverine arrives at a specific moment in franchise history: the post-Endgame hangover, the Disney Plus oversaturation, the box office volatility of Phase 4 and 5, the genuine audience question of whether the MCU still had the capacity to matter the way it once did. Wade's anxiety about relevance, his fear of being pruned by the machine, is the film's way of acknowledging and directly engaging with that cultural conversation rather than pretending it isn't happening. This is braver than it sounds. Most franchise films in moments of cultural uncertainty double down on reassurance. They make things bigger, louder, more connected, more reassuring in their familiarity. Deadpool and Wolverine does the opposite. It acknowledges the uncertainty, puts it in the mouth of its protagonist, and then argues against despair, not by making grand promises about the franchise's future, but by demonstrating, right now, in this movie, that there is still something worth showing up for. The argument is made through the movie itself, rather than about the movie. That's the only way it could have worked, and it's the reason it did. Let's go deeper on the score and music than the earlier segment had space for. Rob Simonson's score for this film operates on a principle that the best film music has always understood. Your job is to serve the story's emotional truth, not to announce it. In a film packed with needle drops, pre-existing songs that arrive with their own associations in history, the original score has to find the spaces those songs leave empty and fill them without competing. It's the musical equivalent of being the person who knows when to talk and when to listen. What Simonson does particularly well is in the transitional passages, the stretches of the film between set pieces, between jokes, between the moments the needle drops are carrying. Here, the score does something quietly ambitious. It keeps the emotional thread alive even when the surface of the film is being deliberately chaotic. When you move from a bloodbath to a sincere conversation to another bloodbath, you need something underneath all of it that's tracking the emotional continuity, reminding you at a subconscious level that these are the same characters, the same story, the same stakes. The score is doing that work constantly, invisibly. The thematic material associated with Logan is worth specific attention. There's a recurring musical phrase that shows up in his scenes: understated, slightly dissonant, built more on texture than on melody, that functions as an emotional signature. It doesn't resolve into anything triumphant. It hangs. It has the quality of something unfinished, of a sentence that keeps stopping before the period. In the context of a character who has decided his own story is over, a musical theme that refuses to arrive at resolution is the kind of compositional choice that works on you without your awareness, deepening the portrait of a man in a state of suspension. Contrast that with what the score does in the final act when Logan fully re-engages. The musical phrase doesn't suddenly become triumphant. It doesn't get the full heroic orchestral treatment that lesser films would reach for. Instead, it simply completes itself. The resolution that was withheld throughout the film arrives quietly, without fanfare, in a moment you might not consciously register. It's the score, making an emotional argument through structure rather than volume. This character hasn't been saved by a single heroic moment. He's been slowly, incrementally choosing to finish his own sentence. And the music has been tracking that process all along. The needle drop philosophy in this film extends beyond the selections themselves to their placement and duration. Most needle drops in action cinema follow a predictable pattern: establish the joke or the mood within the first few bars, run the sequence, fade the song as the action winds down. Deadpool and Wolverine breaks this pattern repeatedly by letting songs run past the point of comfort, past the point where the joke has landed and the sequence has concluded, into a trailing silence where the emotional residue of the song sits in the air. This is most effective in the more emotionally complex selections, the ones where the comedy and the feeling are layered, because it gives the audience time to feel both without rushing to the next thing. The use of Celine Dion, who recorded original music specifically for Deadpool 2 and whose connection to the franchise is now genuinely warm and multi-layered, represents a continuity of musical relationship that few franchises bother to cultivate. It's a small thing, but it's indicative of the care the filmmakers bring to the question of what this series sounds like and how its musical choices add up to something cumulative over time. There's one more scene that demands specific attention before this essay is done, and it's the one that probably gets the least discussion relative to how much it earns, the sequence in the third act where Wade, alone for a moment, takes stock of what he's in the middle of. It's not a long scene. It doesn't have the dramatic architecture of the Void Confession, doesn't have the choreographic spectacle of the fight sequences, doesn't have the comedic density of the multiverse scenes. It's just Wade, briefly still, briefly alone, doing the math on where he is versus where he thought he'd be at this point in his life. The camera doesn't do anything clever. Reynolds doesn't do anything showy. It's just a man thinking, and the particular quality of the thinking, the way it moves between self-deprecation and genuine reckoning, between the joke and the thing the joke is covering, is the film's most transparent moment. What the scene reveals, if you're paying attention, is that Wade has already made the essential choice before the climax demands it. The decision to go all the way, to risk the ending that a character like him statistically doesn't survive, is not made in the heat of the battle or in the clarity of the heroic moment. It's made here, quietly, in advance, in full awareness of what it probably means. The scene is so brief and so quietly placed that it's easy to process as connective tissue, just a moment between bigger moments. But it's the emotional fulcrum the climax pivots on, because when the sacrifice comes, it isn't a surprise. It's the completion of a decision you already watched him make. This is the film's best structural choice, and almost nobody talks about it. Most superhero climaxes work by withholding the character's final choice until the moment demands it. The revelation of what the hero is willing to give is reserved for the peak of the narrative, so it lands with maximum dramatic impact. Deadpool and Wolverine reverses this. It shows you the choice early and quietly, and then it makes you spend the rest of the film knowing. The dramatic irony that generates watching someone move toward an outcome they've already accepted is more sophisticated and more emotionally resonant than the conventional approach, and it's only possible because the film trusts its audience to carry that knowledge without losing investment in the outcome. That trust in the audience, the assumption that you're watching closely, that you're engaged, that you don't need everything announced, runs through the whole film and is ultimately what distinguishes it from the superhero cinema that surrounds it. There's a tendency in franchise filmmaking to assume a distracted audience, to hit every emotional beat twice, to underscore every character choice with dialogue that explains it in case you miss the visual storytelling. Deadpool and Wolverine does the opposite. It trusts your attention. It trusts your emotional intelligence. It trusts that you've been watching closely enough to catch what it's doing in the quiet moments between the loud ones. And it rewards that trust in the only way a film can, by being worth watching closely. By having something in every layer, the surface comedy, the emotional undertow, the meta-commentary, the thematic architecture, the performance nuances, the compositional choices, the cameo meanings, that is genuinely there for the people who want to find it. Not forced, not planted as obvious Easter eggs, but woven into the fabric of the thing so that the more attention you bring to it, the more it gives back. That is the quality that separates a good superhero movie from a meaningful one. The good ones entertain you completely. The meaningful ones also make you feel like you've been seen somewhere in the middle of all the noise, like the film knows what you're worried about, what you're afraid of, what question about your own life you've been carrying, and it's decided to address it sideways, through the story of a man in a red suit and his reluctant, berserker best friend, standing in the ruins of a dying universe, deciding whether to keep going. The answer they arrive at is the same answer any of us arrive at on the days we choose not to give up. Not grand, not cinematic, not earned through a montage or announced with swelling strings. Just, yes. One more time, let's go. Wade Wilson suits up. Logan pops the claws. And the universe, this one, this specific, irreplaceable, officially not that important, to the sacred timeline universe, gets to keep being real for another day. That's enough. That's always been enough. The only thing the machine never figured out is that enough is everything. When Disney acquired 21st Century Fox in 2019, the transaction was covered primarily as a corporate event, billions of dollars, regulatory hearings, a restructuring of the entertainment landscape that returned the X-Men and Fantastic Four to Marvel Studios after decades of licensing separation. The trade press analyzed it in terms of IP portfolios, streaming strategy, and competitive positioning. What almost nobody discussed at the time was the stranger, more human-scale question buried underneath all of it. What happens to the audiences who have spent 20 years building a relationship with specific actors, specific interpretations, specific versions of characters that now belong to a different machine? That question is, in a very real sense, what Deadpool and Wolverine is about. Not as a side concern or a meta joke, as the core of its emotional architecture. The X-Men franchise that Fox built between 2000 and 2019 is a complicated legacy. At its peaks, X2, Days of Future Past, Logan, it was genuinely great cinema, genre filmmaking that took its characters seriously and trusted adult audiences with complex emotional material. At its valleys, X-Men, Apocalypse, Dark Phoenix, the Wolverine films that aren't Logan. It was the kind of filmmaking that makes critics reach for words like squandered and confused. The whole enterprise was tonally inconsistent in ways that were maddening and occasionally charming, built around a revolving door of directors and creative visions that never fully coalesced into anything as unified as the MCU's house style, but also never entirely lost the scrappy, independent spirit of Bryan Singer's original vision. And then it was over, not with a funeral or a final film that acknowledged the ending, just over, acquired, archived, folded into a larger corporate structure that had a different plan for these characters going forward. Deadpool and Wolverine is the first film to actually sit with that. To look at what those 20 years produced, at the characters and actors and stories that came out of that particular creative moment, and to say, this happened, it was real, it mattered, and the fact that the machine has moved on doesn't change any of that. The TVA's role in the story gains a dimension of resonance when you read it through this lens. The Time Variance Authority decides what belongs in the sacred timeline and what gets pruned. It's an institution with absolute authority over what counts as canonical, what gets to continue existing in the official story, and what gets quietly removed because it doesn't fit the current model. If you spent time thinking about how Disney's acquisition of Fox affected the X-Men characters and their place in the larger cultural conversation, who gets recast? Whose story continues, whose version of a character gets quietly retired, the TVA starts to feel less like a fictional organization and more like a pointed metaphor dressed in business casual attire. The film never makes this explicit. It doesn't need to. The metaphor is structurally embedded, and audiences who caught it responded with the kind of knowing recognition you can hear in a theater. Not the loud laugh of a punchline landing, but the quieter, more appreciative acknowledgement of a film that's being honest about itself and its context. Let's go deep on the Deadpool variant sequence now, because it deserves far more granular attention than it typically receives. The concept of Deadpool variant. Alternate versions of Wade Wilson from different timelines, all wearing variations of the costume, all carrying the same basic power set but diverging in history, personality, and circumstance, is the kind of idea that exists at the intersection of comic book logic and movie magic. On paper, it's conceptually straightforward. On screen, it's a logistical and creative challenge of genuine complexity. How do you differentiate multiple versions of the same character, played by the same actor, in the same sequence, without losing the audience in confusion or losing the emotional through-line and spectacle? The film solution is elegant and comes down to a single guiding principle. Each variant communicates its difference primarily through body language and costume rather than through extensive dialogue or backstory. This is a production design and choreography problem as much as a writing problem, and the collaboration between the costume department, the stunt coordinators, and Reynolds himself in developing each variant's specific physical signature is visible in every frame of the sequence. The variant, in the bloodied white costume, moves differently from the primary Wade. Faster, more economical, with the efficiency of someone who has operated in a colder, more brutal version of the universe and has calibrated his body accordingly. The visual contrast between his pallor and the deep red of the blood on his suit tells you something about his history without a single expository line. This is a Wade who has been through worse, who has stayed operational through things that would have broken the character we've been following. He's not more powerful, he's more worn down. And worn down, but still going, is its own kind of character statement. The contrast with the primary Wade in this sequence is doing double thematic work. It shows the breadth of what a single character can become across different circumstances, how identity is partly fixed and partly shaped by the specific pressures a life applies to it. Same base material, dramatically different results depending on what the universe put this person through. This is the multiverse as a tool for character exploration rather than just fan service, and the sequence uses it with precision. The variants who don't survive the sequence, and the film is unsentimental about which ones those are dispatched in ways that are specific to their fighting styles, which means each death tells you something about how that particular variant had been operating. The one who dies taking a hit meant for someone else is, in that single gesture, giving you his whole history in compressed form. This is a Wade who learned to protect whatever timeline he came from. The one who goes down swinging with maximum theatrical commitment is the Wade who never found a reason to stop performing even when it cost him. The specificity is there, even in the deaths, even in the moments the film has only seconds to develop. This sequence also does something quietly important for the film's emotional argument. It makes the primary Wade's survival feel earned rather than inevitable. By populating the sequence with functionally similar Deadpools who die, the film strips away the protagonist armor that audiences unconsciously extend to main characters. For a few minutes, the logic of course he'll make it, he's the title character, stops working because there are 7 other title characters in the frame, and some of them are not making it. The tension that generates is genuine, and it feeds directly into the third act's emotional stakes by reminding you that this specific Wade, the one you've been following, the one with this specific set of relationships and anxieties and choices, his survival is not guaranteed by narrative convention. The relationship between humor and grief in this film operates on a philosophy that's worth articulating explicitly, because it's the animating principle behind almost every creative choice the movie makes, and it's the thing that either works for you or doesn't. The philosophy is this: humor and grief are not opposites, they're not in tension. They're not competing for the same emotional real estate in a scene, where more of one necessarily means less of the other. They are, in fact, natural companions, 2 responses to the same underlying experience of caring about something fragile and knowing it can be lost. This isn't a new observation. It's been the basis of Irish wakes and New Orleans jazz funerals, and the specifically American tradition of roasting someone at a party. The instinct to celebrate through laughter precisely because the alternative, sitting with the weight of love and loss in pure silence, is often more than the psyche can sustain for extended periods. But superhero cinema has almost universally failed to understand this. It tends to cordon grief off from comedy. You get the funny scenes, then you get the sad scenes, and the film manages the transitions between them with editorial care to make sure you don't accidentally feel both things simultaneously and get confused about what you're supposed to be feeling. Deadpool and Wolverine refuses this segregation. It insists, with the confidence of a film that knows exactly what it's doing, that you can be genuinely moved and genuinely laughing at the same moment, and that this isn't a failure of emotional clarity. It's the most emotionally accurate representation of how people actually process difficult things. The scene where Wade eulogizes what his universe represents, interrupted by his own meta-commentary and jokes, landing those jokes while the grief underneath him is unmistakably real. This is the film's fullest expression of that philosophy. Reynolds doesn't go quiet to signal that the sincere part is happening. He doesn't modulate his delivery into something slower and more solemn to cue the audience that this is the part where you're supposed to feel something. He keeps moving, keeps talking, keeps being Wade, and the grief is there anyway, visible through the cracks, present in the gaps between the jokes. The comedy isn't deflecting the emotion, it's carrying it. That's the difference between a character using humor as avoidance and a character for whom humor is the native language of emotional expression. Logan's relationship to this dynamic is the inverse. He doesn't use humor to process grief. Humor, for him, is largely unavailable, at least at the start of the film. He processes grief through silence, through withdrawal, through the specific stillness of someone who has decided that feeling anything too strongly is dangerous because of what it has cost him before. So the comedy in their dynamic comes entirely from the friction between Wade's verbal relentlessness and Logan's refusal to engage. It's funny because one person is trying very hard to speak a language. The other has decided to stop speaking, and the asymmetry is both absurd and, if you catch the emotional logic underneath it, rather heartbreaking. What the film does as it develops their relationship is allow Logan to slowly reclaim access to his own humor, not as a character change, not as a softening that erases who he is, but as evidence that the walls are coming down. You start to catch it in small moments, a flicker of something at the corner of his mouth, a response that isn't quite a laugh but is the closest thing to one he currently has access to. These micro-moments of humor are some of the most emotionally rich things in Jackman's performance because they represent Logan's re-engagement with the world in miniature, small enough to be deniable, real enough to be meaningful. The climax of the film's humor-grief dialectic comes in the sequence that follows their conversation in the void, the stretch before the final battle where both men are moving towards something they're not sure they'll survive. The jokes here are different from the jokes anywhere else in the film. They're quieter, drier, more honest. They're not performing for an audience or deflecting from uncomfortable feelings. They're 2 people who have gotten past the point of pretense, who have shared something true with each other and who are using humor the way people use it with people they trust, as a form of intimacy, a confirmation that you are still there, still present, still yourself, even at the edge of something terrifying. This is what the film does better than any superhero movie in recent memory. It understands that comedy is not the opposite of seriousness. It's how the most serious things survive the telling. The production design across this film deserves a more focused examination, particularly the deliberate contrast between the TVA's visual language and the Void's. The TVA, in Deadpool and Wolverine's version, carries forward the aesthetic established in the Loki series, that particular blend of mid-century modernism and bureaucratic surrealism, all warm oranges and institutional carpeting and filing systems that stretch beyond the horizon. It's a design language that communicates something specific and smart. The organization that manages all of time and space has the aesthetic of a government office circa 1962, because the things that have absolute power over your existence are almost never visually impressive. They're beige. They have fluorescent lighting and motivational posters and someone at the front desk who needs you to fill out the form in triplicate. The horror of the TVA's power is inseparable from its banality, and the production design carries that argument without a single line of dialogue having to make it. The Void is the deliberate inversion of this aesthetic. Where the TVA is ordered, warm, domestically familiar, everything carefully contained and cataloged, the Void is sprawling, tonally gray, existing in a perpetual flat light that makes distances hard to judge and the horizon feel unreliably far away. But within that visual bleakness, the design team makes a crucial creative decision. The wreckage that fills the Void is specific and varied and rich with detail. There are fragments of architecture from recognizable places, pieces of technology that suggest stories you haven't been told, the detritus of realities that had whole histories before they ended up here. The Void looks like abandonment, but is populated with evidence of everything that was abandoned, and that distinction matters enormously. An empty wasteland generates pathos. A wasteland full of specific things generates something closer to grief, the particular sadness of recognizable things in wrong places, of objects that still carry the imprint of lives that no longer exist. The color palette shift as the film moves between these environments is doing deliberate emotional work. The TVA's warmth makes it legible and almost welcoming in spite of its terrifying function, which is exactly how institutional power tends to present itself, with warmth enough to make you compliant. The Void's bleached-out gray makes everything in it feel impermanent, suggests that things here exist in a kind of suspended state between having been real and being nothing. When Wade and Logan's scenes in the Void are lit differently from the wasteland's ambient palette, when a warmer light finds them in their quiet moments together, it's not an accident. The production design is underlining the film's argument. Wherever these two men are, together and honest, is warmer than their surroundings. Connection generates its own light. It sounds corny stated directly, but executed through deliberate lighting and color design, it lands as truth. Sean Levy's directorial approach across this film, compared to the Tim Miller and David Leitch entries in the franchise, is worth articulating because it represents a real creative evolution in how the Deadpool films think about themselves. Tim Miller's original Deadpool was an insurgent film. It knew it was doing something the studio wasn't sure about, and that uncertainty generated a particular scrappy, inventive energy. The film had to fight to exist, and you can feel that in its texture. The low budget deployed cleverly, the jokes landing with the confidence of someone who's been rehearsing them in secret for years, the action sequences that compensate for lack of scale with wit and precision. It was a film made by people who wanted to prove something, and it proved it comprehensively. David Leitch's Deadpool 2 was a different kind of film, more polished, more expensive, more structurally ambitious in its willingness to go emotionally dark and then find its way back to comedy. Leitch's background in action choreography gave the set pieces a kinetic sophistication the first film didn't have, and the emotional story. Wade processing loss, finding a surrogate family, making a sacrifice that the film's post-credit sequence then immediately undercut, was more genuinely affecting than many gave it credit for. Levy's approach in the third film is different from both. Where Miller was scrappy and Leitch was kinetically ambitious, Levy is architecturally intelligent. He thinks about how movies feel over time rather than just in individual scenes. His instinct is to build, to lay foundation early, to trust that setup will pay off, to resist the temptation to spend every creative resource immediately. This is why the early sections of the film, which some critics found slow or meandering, are doing more structural work than they appear to be. Levy is establishing the emotional geography the third act will need, creating the attachments and context that make the climax's risks feel genuinely risky. His particular contribution to the franchise is emotional coherence. The first two films were tonally confident but occasionally chaotic, scenes that didn't fully connect to the larger emotional arc, jokes that pulled focus from story rather than serving it. Levy is a more disciplined architect in this sense. He tracks the emotional logic of every scene more carefully, ensures that the comedy is always anchored in character rather than floating free of it, maintains the connective tissue between scenes that makes a 2-hour film feel like one sustained experience rather than a highlight reel. The result is a Deadpool film that is funnier in some ways than its predecessor, not because it has more jokes or better jokes, but because the jokes are better placed. They arrive in the right spots, hit the right notes, and leave room for what comes next. The specific choreography of the film's climactic battle in the void, the full-scale confrontation with Cassandra Nova and her forces, contains a detail that nobody seems to talk about, and that represents one of the most intelligent decisions in the film's action vocabulary. Throughout the battle, Wade and Logan fight in coordination for the first time with genuine intentionality, not just spatial awareness of each other, but actual complementary strategy, each man filling the gaps the other leaves, each covering the angles the other can't cover. This sounds like standard buddy action movie teamwork, and in execution, it would be easy to film as exactly that, two guys fighting side by side, the camera cutting between their individual contributions, the editing making the point that they work well together without showing the actual mechanics of why. Levy and his choreographers do something more specific and more revealing. They design the choreography around each character's limitations rather than their strengths. Wade is relentless and unpredictable but not particularly efficient. His fighting style generates chaos, which is useful, but it also creates openings. Logan is devastatingly efficient in a straight line, but has vulnerabilities in his peripheral field when he's fully committed to a target. Their combat partnership in this sequence is designed so that each man's style covers the other's structural weakness. Wade's chaos screens, Logan's forward commitment. Logan's efficient, decisive strikes give Wade room to recover from the overextensions his style inevitably produces. This is character choreography rather than action choreography. The fighting is revealing who these people are and how their relationship has evolved, not just demonstrating what they can do. And it maps directly onto their emotional dynamic in the film. Wade's unpredictability forces Logan to adapt, to engage, to stay present and responsive rather than operating on autopilot. Logan's groundedness gives Wade something to orient around, a center of gravity that his own chaos can spiral around without flying apart entirely. In the fighting, as in everything else, they are better together than either is alone, not because their combined power is greater, but because each provides what the other most needs. The film sets up, fairly explicitly, the possibility that resolving the crisis will require the kind of sacrifice that the franchise has gestured toward before. The structural logic of one of these characters has to pay a permanent price is well established enough in superhero cinema that audiences arrive at the climax with that expectation in their bodies, waiting for the moment when the cost becomes clear. What the film does with that expectation is precise and somewhat subversive. It doesn't refuse a sacrifice. There is real cost here. Real putting of skin in the game, and the film doesn't pretend otherwise. But it reframes what sacrifice means in this specific context. The sacrifice isn't one character vanishing so another can live, the zero-sum exchange that the genre has trained audiences to anticipate. It's both characters choosing to fully commit to something beyond their own survival, which is a different kind of sacrifice. Not self-annihilation, but self-extension. The willingness to spend everything you have on something outside yourself. For Logan, this is the culmination of his arc. He has spent the film refusing to invest, refusing to extend himself toward the world, refusing to let his capabilities translate into care because care has cost him catastrophically before. The final battle is where that refusal ends, not because he's been convinced by an argument or because his guilt has been resolved, but because Wade's specific, stubborn, loud, exhausting belief in him has created a situation where refusing to care is the harder choice. Logan doesn't defeat his grief in the third act. He acts in spite of it. He chooses investment over withdrawal with full knowledge of what investment has cost him, and that choice, informed, conscious, made without the guarantee that it won't cost him again, is the most honest version of courage the film offers. For Wade, the sacrifice is different in texture. He has been trying to earn his place throughout the film, to demonstrate worth, to justify existence, to prove to the cosmic machine and perhaps to himself that this universe and this character deserve to persist. The moment where he stops calculating worth and simply acts, where the question, "Do I deserve to be here?" goes quiet and is replaced by the simpler, more powerful, "I am here, and this is what I'm doing with it," is the emotional climax of his arc. Not triumphant, not resolved, just present, fully, irreversibly present. The aftermath of the battle uses the visual language of aftermath rather than triumph, which is the right choice. There's no swelling score underlining the victory. There's no montage of restored relationships and repaired worlds set to an uplifting needle drop. What there is, instead, is the specific texture of two people sitting in the rubble of something that just happened, catching their breath, taking stock, existing in the particular quiet that follows the end of a sustained crisis. It's filmed with the matter-of-factness of the genuinely exhausted rather than the glamour of the heroic, and that choice is what makes it land as emotionally honest rather than sentimental. The exchange between Wade and Logan in the aftermath, brief, tonally calibrated somewhere between dry and tender, functions as the film's actual emotional resolution, the moment where everything the story has been building arrives at something like rest. It doesn't answer the big thematic questions. It doesn't wrap the grief and the failure and the insecurity in a neat resolution bow. It just establishes, between two people who started this film as strangers and ended as something harder to name, that what happened mattered, and that they are, at this particular moment, okay, not fixed, not healed, not past it. Okay, with the specific, fragile meaning that word carries when people who've been through something hard say it to each other and mean it. The decision to give the film this kind of ending, quiet, imperfect, earned, rather than the maximalist closure that franchise finales tend to reach for, is the choice that most clearly reveals what Levy and Reynolds understood this story was actually trying to do. Grand finales are for stories that were trying to be grand. This story was trying to be honest. And honesty, when it arrives at the end of 2 hours of noise and blood and pop songs and meta-commentary and genuine heartbreak, sounds like two people catching their breath and choosing, with full awareness of the cost, to call what they have enough. Here's what the post-credit sequences are doing, that the main film's closing doesn't have space to address, and why they matter beyond the obvious function of setup and fan service. The tradition of superhero post-credit scenes has evolved considerably across 20-plus years of MCU output. At their crudest, they're trailers masquerading as coda, a scene that exists only to announce what's coming next, using the audience's goodwill and engagement from the film they just watched as promotional real estate for something they haven't seen yet. At their best, they're the last word of the film's emotional statement, a quiet button that recontextualizes or extends something the main narrative established. Deadpool and Wolverine's post-credit sequences lean toward the latter, and they do it through a deliberate tonal shift. After 2+ hours of meta-commentary and self-awareness, the post-credits material strips away most of the winking and finds something warmer and more direct. It's the film remembering what it was actually about, underneath all the noise, and saying it one more time in a quieter register. The content of these scenes, the specific callbacks, the character moments, the acknowledgement of where people are in the aftermath, functions as confirmation that the emotional work the film has been doing landed. You need to see the relationships in the aftermath to understand whether the story's thesis held, that choosing to engage, to invest, to care, despite the cost, produces something real. The post-credits aren't there to set up the next film, though they gesture toward it. They're there to check in on the people you've been following and confirm that what happened between them is still happening, that the connections forged in the chaos didn't dissolve when the crisis ended. There's a grace note in how Wade engages with the post-credits audience. That is, in its way, the film's most honest moment. He's aware it's a post-credits scene. Of course he is. He's been aware of everything, but the awareness this time isn't deployed defensively or comically. It's deployed as a form of acknowledgement, a direct look at the people who stayed through the credits, and a recognition that their presence here, after everything, is its own kind of loyalty. The meta-commentary, used for once not as armor but as genuine connection, lands differently. It's still funny, but it's funny the way something is funny when it's also true. What this film leaves the genre is harder to quantify than box office records or franchise milestones, but it's real and it will be felt. It demonstrates concretely and commercially that superhero audiences are not children who need their emotional experiences managed at all times. They can hold complexity. They can sit with grief that doesn't resolve. They can laugh at something and feel it simultaneously. They can follow a film that acknowledges its own artifice and still be moved by its sincerity. These aren't small things in a genre that has frequently underestimated the people sitting in its audience, and the size of Deadpool and Wolverine's response suggests that audiences have been waiting, with considerable patience, for a film that credited them with this capacity. It also demonstrates that the R rating is a creative tool, not merely a content classification. The difference between this film and a PG-13 version of itself isn't just violence, it's emotional honesty. PG-13 superhero films operate under a set of invisible constraints that go beyond the MPAA's guideline. They can't let grief sit too long. They can't let failure feel genuinely consequential. They can't let characters be ugly in the specific, unflattering ways that real people are ugly when they're broken. The R rating gives Deadpool and Wolverine permission to be honest about all of these things, and the film uses that permission every time it matters, not to be transgressive but to be accurate. The legacy for Deadpool and Wolverine as characters is genuinely open-ended, in the best sense. Both men are alive, both are changed, and neither change is complete. Wade is in the MCU now, with all the creative challenges and possibilities that implies. Logan exists in a form that the narrative hasn't finished exploring, in a universe that the film has decided is worth keeping. What comes next for both of them is unwritten, which is exactly as it should be. The ending of the film isn't a conclusion, it's a choice. Two men choosing to keep going, choosing to remain present, choosing to find out what comes after the worst thing they've been through. That's not a franchise setup dressed as an ending. That's the oldest story there is, told in the loudest, bloodiest, funniest, most self-aware superhero movie the genre has ever produced. The simple, radical, inexhaustibly human decision to show up again tomorrow. The machine, for once, didn't get to decide how it ends. They did.